It has always and will continue to be a hot topic in the world of broadcasting. The rights of broadcasters versus what the FCC deems suitable for air. Do broadcasters go too far, or is the FCC just way too strict? Is freedom of speech being taken away? This is the latest hot topic in the discussion and the continuation of our constitutional law series. Today's Legal Corner is joining us. Now, sorry, I apologize for that. In today's Legal Corner, attorney and legal correspondent David Lesch is joining us. Welcome to the set, David.
Nice to be back.
Not a problem. I kind of I got nervous. I
Have
heard
you missed
FCC.
me? You haven't seen me in a couple of weeks, so I'm back now. All right, so here's the thing. When we're talking about constitutional law, as opposed to some of the other segments that I've done when I'm here, there's never really any clear answer. As opposed to, landlord-tenant situations or other areas of law that I've discussed, there are statutes. This is the law. This is how you should react to it. This is how you should get your papers in, and the time limits. When we're talking about constitutional law now, I'm glad we're back on the constitutional law series. Sometimes viewers, they say to me, well, you know what, I really enjoyed the discussion, but what's the answer? And sometimes I say, well, with respect to the topic, there really isn't an answer. But the point of constitutional law is that it's the area of the law that is the least black and white. It's all gray. And the interesting part about it, why I like discussing areas of constitutional law, is because it gives me a chance to kind of look at both sides and just really stretch my brain into trying and get my arms around it to try and figure out what's going on here. And today, I picked this particular topic because I am, in some respects, a broadcaster now, and there are things that I and you cannot say on television. And what we're really talking about is we're talking about indecency laws, right? What's considered to be decent or indecent. But before we do, we have to take a step back to also talk about obscenity laws. Obscenity laws are different than indecency laws, but both will impact the First Amendment freedom of speech, such the constitutional law issue, freedom of speech. I'm going to give you an example of a type of statute that has limited your ability to distribute or give things out to the public that the government might seem to be obscene. Okay. One particular statute prohibits using, for instance, like the internet to traffic material that would be obscene, lewd, lascivious, indecent, filthy, or vile. So that's the government's way to basically prohibit certain people from selling certain things that they feel would be considered to be obscene. Okay, this isn't so much indecent. This is obscene. Now, why is that important? Because it impacts on the First Amendment freedom of speech, in that freedom of speech allows us to be able to say what we want when we want in public. And there are certain types of speech that are immediately protected. For instance, political speech. It's the type of speech that the founders, when they created the Constitution, that they immediately said, well, we have to be able to say what we want about certain leaders, because we couldn't do that when the king was taking over the colonies or was ruling the colonies. So basically, there's a freedom of speech. Obviously, political speech will be encompassed. But when you're talking about something that might be considered indecent or obscene, sexual speech, well, the framers never really considered that to be part of the First Amendment. So when the courts look at this, they have a very difficult time protecting it. So what they have done in the past is they've tried to define what is considered to be pornographic speech, or speech that you should not be able to say. And the Supreme Court judges, who are some of the brightest men and women in the land, have had a hard time defining what is considered to be lewd speech. One particular judge back in 1964, in a very famous case, and the Supreme Court justice in his concurring opinion basically said, and you may remember this, said, well, I don't know what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. In other words, I know speech that is not allowed. I can't define it. Well, if a Supreme Court justice can't put into words what would be considered to be obscene, how could you and I know exactly what is or is not obscene? So we now have a test. Okay, there's a test that you have to basically meet in able to have certain things not considered to be obscene. And that's work that is, if it's taken as a whole, lacks serious literary or artistic value and appeals to the prurient interest, that would be something that would be considered to be obscene. But the problem is, what is defined by a prurient interest by one person is not necessarily the same as what's defined by somebody else. You might have somebody who thinks that anything could be said in public, yet you have somebody else who's very prim and proper.
Okay.
That leads to the indecency laws, which is really what we're discussing today. What you can say while you're on air. Do you understand?
Yes.
So the question now is on air, well, why can't I say whatever I want to say? Certain words, I don't understand it. There's freedom of speech, it's protected by the Constitution. And I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Because your ability to be on air is not a right, it's a privilege. It's granted to you by the federal government and monitored by the FCC. Similarly, it's to driving a car. You don't have a right to drive a car, you have a privilege to drive a car, you have a privilege to get a license. It's not a right, it's considered to be a privilege. It's semantics, but it's still a difference that's looked at in the law.
Okay.
When you have a privilege under the law, you have to still meet certain requirements. So something may still be considered to be not obscene,
Okay.
but yet indecent. So that is why, you know, I don't think you remember George Carlin had a famous comedy skit back into the late 70s, the 7 words that you can't say on TV. And he would say these words over and over and over again during his comedy skit. It was very, very funny, but you could not say it on air. And then now you have some of the award, the MTV awards, and you
Yes.
see people get up there and they say words that they shouldn't say, and it gets bleeped out, and they get in trouble. Oh, okay. Because those words are considered to be indecent. The problem is it runs afoul of the First Amendment freedom of speech, and courts have been trying to hold the FCC back. The FCC said, look, when television was first created, we as viewers have a limited amount of content that we can watch.
Okay.
Only a few channels. So when you put on the TV, you're a captive audience. You can't say certain things because you're going to be able to see your children, you're going to see things that are going to be offensive. But that's not the way it is now. There's not just a couple of channels. There are hundreds of channels you can watch. Other ways to get information. You can pick up books out of the library, different ways to read things that somebody might consider to be indecent. So why should you not have the right to say certain words or to show certain scenes that others might think is graphic, but you think is protected by freedom of speech? Remember, freedom of speech is not just the spoken word. It's films, it's pictures, it's all covered.
Is that why regular broadcasts at first, there were the set standard of channels, the ABCs, the NBCs of the world, and then we went to cable, where cable, it seems like the rules are a little different?
Because you pay for cable.
Okay.
You pay extra money for cable. CBS, ABC, those channels are free to the public. That's a privilege to watch that. You're not paying for that. That's a privilege. You're watching free network television. Now, of course, there are advertisements. So how free is it when you think about it? You're forced to watch advertisements. But when you pay to watch channels, well, that's different. You're paying for now you have a right because you're paying for something. So you have a right to see something coming back. But it doesn't mean on those channels they can show anything.
Okay.
Do you understand? There are certain things that you cannot see, and that's a whole area of the law. But in terms of like what we're talking about right now, and you and I do not have the ability to say certain things on air.
No.
That is because the FCC has said that we have a privilege of being here, and we're going to monitor it because children may be watching this show, and we don't want children to see certain things. Now you can always say, well, the parent can change the channel. Children have other ways of seeing things that they shouldn't see. They go on the internet, and the courts have allowed internet certain things to be, to be shown because we want to give parents still give parents the opportunity to see certain things. So I guess wrapping up, very quickly, there is no real answer, again, in this constitutional law segment, as to whether or not you can or cannot say things, but the most important thing you have to remember is there is a right to freedom of speech, and that you have to be careful if others are impeding on your right, and it's something you should always be thinking about.
Can you log on to the FCC and find out like your rights? What are the current rights? What are the rules,
I
regulations?
believe it's www.fcc.com, I believe.
Okay.
Okay,
Or
.org,
.org.
or .org, I believe
Okay.
it is. But you can see it, and they can tell you what you would be limited in your abilities to say while you're on the air.